Let's talk through Kubernetes, which is a orchestration layer for containers. There's a couple ways to install it. One is Docker Desktop is a great way to install it either on Windows or on Mac. If you're a more advanced user, you could actually go through here and do a kubectl command, and you could use these curl commands. But let's get into the overview now. So what is Kubernetes and how did it actually get its start? Well, it started in 2014 and it was developed by Google. And it's a useful tool for containerized applications. So really the idea is it's a container orchestration system, right? That's the key difference. And Amazon has one that hosts the Kubernetes service. Google has one called GKE, and Microsoft has one called AKS. So there's a lot of different places to use these containers. And in particular, a few of the big capabilities of Kubernetes are highly available architecture, auto-scaling, rich ecosystem, service discovery, health management, secrets and configuration management. So there's a lot of things that come with Kubernetes that you get for free. So let's go through and look at a basic workflow and walk this through. So the first thing you would do, this is really step number one, is you would create a Kubernetes cluster. The next step would be you could deploy your application, right? So you go through here, push a application into the cluster, and then number three, you would want to expose the port. So this means that your internal port would be exposed to, let's say, a web browser or a mobile client. Now, when there's more traffic and the traffic is exceeding the demands of the current environment, you could tell the application to automatically scale up. And then later, so that would be step number four, and then later, potentially you'd want to do another update using, let's say, continuous delivery, and that would happen by pushing changes automatically to the cluster. So what is the cluster architecture? In general, it looks something like this, where your entire cluster, when you say cluster, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the hood. And in particular, one of the things to be aware of is a node, right? So if you see, this is kind of the basic structure, right, of a node, but let's dig into those details. So first up, we have actual containers themselves. So if you look at a Docker format container, that Docker format container would be one of these, but you can have multiple containers running inside something called a pod. And so that's what this does, is a pod goes through here and you could run some series of containers inside and then have a IP address associated with it. Alternately, you also can have multiple pods all running inside of a Kubernetes node. So you can have multiple containers inside of a pod, and you can have multiple pods inside of a node. Now, the master is where all of the controls take place. So this Kubernetes API here allows the orchestration to these different nodes. And so that's really the reason for this Kubernetes architecture, is that you can scale things up and down, and you have control over starting and stopping containers. And so it's a jobs orchestration system. So it's really like the puppet master of your system. So where can you run these things? Well, as I mentioned before, you can run it with Amazon AKS. You can run it on Google through Google GKE or Azure with their Kubernetes service. You also, if you're using Docker, you can actually run it locally. And here's a good example of a very simple Kubernetes application where you could expose it on port 8080, and that would be the service. And then inside of here, you would have your endpoints where things would get set up, and you could have a separate database that would live here. So when you want to deploy it, you could just say Docker stack deploy. So you can also do complex Kubernetes-based applications locally on your laptop. Now, let's get into the killer feature of Kubernetes, which is the ability to auto-scale up and down. And the way that works is via this thing called the horizontal pod autoscaler. So let's kind of scroll through and take a look at this. So what happens is that this HPA control loop is going through and just constantly, in a loop, looking at the different metrics from the system and looking for health metrics like, maybe CPU, memory, things like that. And if there's a threshold that's met, what will happen is the nodes will actually scale out and there'll be more nodes that go up. And so this is really the core architecture and why Kubernetes in general works really well for job management is that it has the ability to listen to everything that's happening, look at the health metrics, and kind of scale things up and down. So in a nutshell, that's what containers are inside of Kubernetes. They're all isolated inside of this master architecture, and Kubernetes is the thing that controls it. And so if it's been something that mystifies you before, this is a way of kind of simplifying things and really looking at the fact that underneath the hood here, you've got a container and you've got a system that orchestrates that container. And really that's Kubernetes in a nutshell.